Well, now I don't know what to do. I had thought that Deepa was actually going to explain. So let's actually do what Deepa was trying to do before she was so rudely interrupted. So let me bring up Flex Builder here. And basically, so how many people have looked at any of the Flex source code for any of the components? Anybody looked at that? So a bunch of people. Let me show you what it looks like. So what I did was I took button, the source code of button, which is probably one of the simplest controls. Things like lists are much, much more complicated. And I went through and exhaustively removed most of the comments because all the documentation here, so that it's much, much shorter than if you had to actually look at it yourself. But you can see that there is still a lot of code. And when you actually start just scrolling down and saying, what the hell does all this stuff do? You'll see things like this. This is how a button is rendered. This is the measure thing, right? So, what are the metrics? Gathering all of that stuff together. It's a tremendous amount of code. So let me show you some of the how you write stuff in Gumbo. So I've got the source code. Glenn Ruley, who was one of the guys who interrupted Deepa, wrote this. And this is a weather component. So basically, it just focuses on the core functionality, the data model of weather, events that happen to stuff, integrating if they're back-end services. It extends Skinnable component, which is a new component that's part of Gumbo, which is sort of the core root component that you inherit from. And it exposes one skin part. So this is how it says, I am skinnable. And that is the selector. And then it exposes a property later on that you hook up to. But this is it. And you can see there's no drawing code or anything like that. It has the zip codes, and it's really about the data model. Now to use it, that's called weatherpod.as. We just say, put a weatherpod there. And we also say attach a skin, because it didn't provide a default skin. And so just with that, what I can do is run that, and I get, this is what Deepa had up there, and I'll show you what the skin looks like. So this is the programmer art version of this component. If I go and look at the skin, there's no ActionScript code at all. It is just MXML, and it's using things like the rect, which is part of that new graphic subsystem we created. It also uses states so that it specifies what happens when you do things like hover over it. I mentioned briefly that there's a new state syntax. How many people have looked at the old state syntax? It's fairly complicated. Basically what it does is you've got this big section that says like add this, modify this property on this thing, and it makes it very hard to read. With the new state syntax, all you do is you go up to the component and say, for example, is it in a particular state? And if there is a property like the alpha, you say alpha.hovered, which means here's like in the hovered state. Here's what it looks like in the selected state. So it's a much more condensed syntax. It's easier to read, easier for you to deal with. But basically, we can also go back to our weather app and just change this. We gave it to a designer. And just by changing the skin, we come up with a completely different look and feel that looks much more like what we might want it to look, if you were really designing something. And it starts to look more like an accordion. And so let me show you how that was done. So this is the skin to the component. So basically it adds a drop shadow filter, it adds a rectangle, and then says put a list here and give it the item renderer of this des weather item renderer. And this is using the new Gumbo list component. And so this is what the the item renderer looks like. Uses a couple of states. It uses transitions to talk about how the panels expand. And it uses some recs and some labels and specifies where to put the images. So you've got a really nice, clean separation. You didn't have to go in and write any action script code. You didn't have to alter the core functionality of the component. And what we also did was we said, well, how would I take this and move it to like a mobile device? And so I can just create a different skin and add that. Now what we wind up with is this. Now this is the same component. So one of the things that you saw in Flex is that components really had a specific look and feel. But this, instead of going up and down, sort of fling these things. I can click over here, hop through. So it looks much more like what you'd have on a mobile device. So with Flex 4 with Gumbo, what you can start to do is really just focus on that core functionality and then use the new graphic subsystem, the new skinning architecture to really fine-tune what your component looks like without having to go in and modify any of that core logic. So a big part of the motivation for this is really the problem of how we create rich internet applications today. And they're really sort of two constituents. There's the designer and the developer. And the designer typically works with a tool like Photoshop, and what they do is they sort of what an app looks like. And then they give that to a developer, and the developer is responsible for doing all of this stuff because it's very, very technical. It's using ActionScript code. And so what we wanted to do was solve the core problem. And what is that? Well, it's that designers don't really own the design. They create stuff that they give to a developer, but when they give a Photoshop file or a piece of paper, a printout, or a bitmap image or a PDF, you really lose that design intent. And the developer then is given this thing that he doesn't know what to do with, and so he has to go and figure out how they're going to actually implement it. So what I've done is, by creating this graphic subsystem, by creating the new component model, we've made it so that designers can really own the design and developers can own the code, and they can really work together. That's what we designed Thermo really to enable. And it allows a designer or a developer to really start with static artwork. They can take that, you can go into Fireworks and save it as FXG or import directly from that tool. They can use the drawing tools in Thermo to create new assets or modify what they brought in. They can then, because it's been turned into MXML, they can start to work and transform that, take the pictures of the components and actually turn it into actual components and use things like states, interactions, transitions, and effects to add interactive behavior. So let me show you a quick demo of Thermo. I showed you it briefly before. We're going to do something different this time. And what I want to do first, actually, while that's firing up, is I'm going to open Photoshop. We'll take a look at a comp. Blow that up a little bit. So this is sort of a mock-up of a little app that we created. Sorry about that. And this is how a lot of applications start. They start in something like Photoshop, and a designer comes in and they draw a picture of what the app looks like, and then they give it to a developer who's expected to actually turn that into an application. So let me show you how Thermo aids in that. So here's the layers, and you can see that there are things like text layers here. One of the things you'll notice is that these are sort of little buttons, and what the designer did was they actually took two images